The forgotten secrets of the medieval world that history didn't tell. You are looking at a symbol carved into cold stone, repeated across distant cities that never shared the same ruler, the same language, or the same history. It appears in the shadows of cathedrals, hidden in the margins of manuscripts, etched into places no ordinary craftsman would risk leaving a mark. And yet no official record explains it, no chronicle mentions it, no historian can fully account for it. That should not be possible. Because the Middle Ages were supposed to be documented, controlled, and defined by those in power. Every king recorded, every war justified, every belief shaped by institutions that claimed authority over truth itself. So how does something like this exist? Outside the system, beyond explanation, untouched by the official story. This is where the narrative begins to fracture. What if the world you were taught to see was only the surface? What if beneath the noise of battles and crowns, there existed a quieter structure? One that did not need recognition to shape reality. A network that moved without leaving obvious traces, that communicated without speaking openly, that preserved knowledge without writing it down. Look closer at that symbol again. It is not just a mark, it is a signal, a fragment of something that was never meant to be understood by everyone. Only by those who already knew where to look. And once you begin to notice it, you start to realize something unsettling. This was never an isolated detail. It is a pattern. And patterns, when repeated across time and space, are never accidents. So the question is no longer what this symbol means. The real question is far more dangerous. Who was it for? Because if it was not meant for everyone, then it was meant for someone. And if someone was receiving these messages, then there was a system operating in silence, parallel to everything history chose to record. And that means one thing. The Middle Ages were not what you think they were. They were something far more complex, far more controlled, and far more hidden. The lie about the Middle Ages. You were taught to see the Middle Ages as a void, a stretch of time swallowed by ignorance where nothing meaningful could survive, a world defined by fear, rigid belief, and intellectual silence. That image feels stable because it has been repeated so often that it no longer invites doubt. But the moment you slow down and begin to observe the details that were never emphasized, that certainty begins to dissolve. Look at what was actually built during this period. Structures rise with a level of precision that demands planning, calculation, and knowledge that cannot exist in a world supposedly disconnected from learning. Cathedrals align with celestial patterns. Stone is shaped with consistency that suggests more than crude experimentation. These are not random achievements. They point to understanding, to systems of knowledge that were not only present, but actively applied. So the question emerges quietly at first, almost uncomfortable to ask. If knowledge was absent, how were these things created? And if knowledge was present, why were you told it was not? The answer is not simple, and that is exactly what makes it powerful. Because labeling an era as dark does more than describe it. It simplifies it. It compresses complexity into something easy to accept, easy to repeat, and difficult to challenge. Once that label is in place, anything that contradicts it begins to fade into the background, dismissed as anomaly instead of evidence. Now consider the movement of people and ideas. Trade routes during this time connected distant regions with a level of coordination that required trust, communication, and shared systems. Information did not vanish. It traveled, quietly, consistently, carried by individuals who understood its value. Not everything needed to be written down to exist. Not everything needed to be visible to influence the world. And that is where the narrative begins to shift. Because what you start to see is not the absence of knowledge, but its relocation. It was not gone. It was simply not where you expected it to be. It moved through restricted circles, passed from one mind to another, preserved through memory, through symbols, through methods that did not rely on official recognition. Why would that happen? Because visibility invites control. What is written can be censored. What is public can be reshaped, but what moves in silence is far more difficult to contain. It exists outside the reach of those who define what should be remembered and what should be forgotten. This changes the way you interpret everything. Because now the Middle Ages are no longer a passive era waiting to be rediscovered. They become an active environment where information was managed, where narratives were shaped, and where certain forms of knowledge were allowed to remain hidden. Not lost, not destroyed, hidden. And once you accept that possibility, the idea of a dark age begins to feel less like a description and more like a cover. A way to ensure that the deeper layers are never examined too closely. Now return to the symbol you saw at the beginning. It was never explained because it does not belong to the official narrative. It exists outside of it, untouched by the version of history that was simplified for mass understanding. And yet, it survived, repeated across locations that should not share the same language of expression. That is not coincidence. That is continuity. Which means that beneath the visible structure of the Middle Ages, there was another system operating with its own logic, its own methods, and its own purpose. A system that did not rely on recognition to persist, only on those who knew how to interpret it. And if that system was real, then everything you thought was missing may have been deliberately placed out of reach, not erased, repositioned, waiting for someone to notice. The hidden world, a parallel reality. Now that the surface has begun to crack, you can start to see what was always there, just beneath it. Not a single hidden detail, not an isolated anomaly, but something far more structured. A second layer of reality moving alongside the one that history chose to preserve. Quiet, deliberate, and almost impossible to detect unless you know what to look for. Imagine walking through a medieval city. The noise, the markets, the authority of the church, the presence of rulers. Everything appears visible, controlled, explained. But beneath that surface, another system is operating. Messages are exchanged without words. Knowledge is transferred without records. Decisions are influenced by individuals who never appear in official accounts. This is where the idea becomes difficult to ignore. There were not one but two Middle Ages unfolding at the same time. One was designed to be seen. It was recorded, documented, shaped into a narrative that could be passed down and taught. The other existed without needing recognition. It moved through symbols, through coded behavior, through networks that did not depend on visibility to function. And the most unsettling part is how naturally both worlds coexisted. Because the visible world gave the illusion of control, it created the sense that everything important was happening in plain sight. But the invisible world did not compete with it. It used it. It moved through it, around it, sometimes even because of it. Hidden in rituals, embedded in structures, disguised within what seemed ordinary. You begin to notice patterns once you allow yourself to see beyond the surface. Similar markings appearing in distant places. Unexplained consistencies in construction methods. Fragments of ideas that reappear across regions that should not have shared direct contact. These are not coincidences. They are traces of communication, evidence of connection. But connection between whom? That is the question that transforms curiosity into tension. Because if these patterns are real, then there were groups, individuals, or networks capable of maintaining continuity across time and distance without relying on the systems we recognize today. They operated with intention. They preserved knowledge with discipline. They understood something that the official world either ignored or could not fully control. This is not about conspiracy. It is about structure. A system does not need to be visible to be real. It only needs consistency, repetition, purpose. And once you identify those elements, the hidden layer stops feeling like speculation and starts to feel like something far more concrete. Look again at the world you were shown. Kings rise and fall. Wars reshape borders. Institutions claim authority over truth. But underneath all of it, something remains stable. Something continues, unaffected by the chaos above it. That stability does not come from power as it is usually defined. It comes from knowledge, from understanding how to move without being noticed, how to communicate without being heard, how to exist without being recorded. And that kind of existence requires precision. It requires rules, which means this hidden world was not random. It was organized. Now the question deepens. If there was a system operating in silence, then it must have had methods, ways to preserve what mattered, ways to ensure that information reached the right people and no one else. Because without structure, nothing survives across time. So how did they do it? How do you maintain knowledge without writing it down in a world obsessed with control over written truth? The answer to that question reveals something even more unexpected, because the most powerful knowledge in that era was not lost. It was never meant to be written at all. Secret number 1: knowledge that was never written. Now you are standing at the edge of something far more controlled than you expected. Not just hidden symbols or quiet networks, but a deliberate decision about how knowledge itself should exist. Because in a world where written words could be monitored, altered, or destroyed, the most valuable ideas could not afford to be captured on parchment. So they were not. Think about what happens the moment something is written. It becomes visible. It can be copied, misinterpreted, confiscated, or erased. It enters a system where authority decides what survives and what disappears. But if knowledge never enters that system, it cannot be controlled in the same way. It moves differently. It lives differently. This is where the structure becomes clear. Knowledge was not abandoned. It was redirected. It moved through voices instead of ink. It passed from teacher to student in carefully chosen moments, within controlled environments where trust mattered more than documentation. It required presence, attention, memory. You could not simply find it. You had to be brought into it. That changes everything, because now knowledge is no longer a resource. It becomes a filter. Only those who are prepared, selected, or initiated can access it. Not because it is hidden in a distant place, but because it exists in a form that cannot be casually obtained. Imagine learning something that cannot be written down, something that loses its meaning the moment it is removed from context, something that depends on tone, on gesture, on timing. You begin to understand why it had to be preserved this way, not out of secrecy alone, but out of necessity. This is why fragments appear in manuscripts that feel incomplete, almost intentionally vague, hints without full explanations, diagrams without instructions, as if the written word was never meant to carry the entire truth, only to point towards something beyond itself. And those who knew how to interpret those fragments were not relying on the page. They were recalling something they had already been given, something that could not be fully seen by anyone outside that circle. This creates a different kind of power, not the visible power of kings or institutions, but the quiet authority of understanding, the ability to hold knowledge that cannot be taken because it does not exist in a form that can be seized. It lives within people, not within objects, and that makes it incredibly resilient. Empires fall, libraries burn, records disappear, but knowledge that is carried from mind to mind continues. It adapts, it survives, it evolves without leaving a clear trail behind. Now reconsider everything you thought was lost. What if it was never lost at all? What if it simply moved beyond the reach of those who controlled written history? This is where the hidden world reveals one of its most effective strategies. It does not fight for visibility. It avoids it. It does not compete with official knowledge. It exists alongside it, untouched, because it never fully enters the same space. And that explains something you may have overlooked. If knowledge was preserved this way, then there had to be signals, subtle indicators that allowed those within the system to recognize each other, ways to confirm who understood and who did not, because without that, the chain would break. So the next question becomes unavoidable. If the most important knowledge was never written, then how did they communicate its presence? The answer is already around you, carved in stone, hidden in plain sight, seen by everyone, understood by almost no one. Secret number 2, symbols that were messages. Now you begin to notice something that was always there, but never explained. Shapes carved into stone that repeat with strange precision. Patterns embedded in walls, in ceilings, in the quiet corners of structures that were never meant to attract attention. At first glance, they seem decorative, almost insignificant. But the more you observe, the less random they feel. Because repetition is never accidental. If a symbol appears once, it can be dismissed. If it appears again, it becomes curious. But when it appears across regions, across decades, across structures built by different hands, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes intentional. This is where the visible world starts to reveal the hidden one. Architecture in the Middle Ages was not just about building, it was about encoding, not openly, not in a way that would disrupt the official narrative, but subtly, layered within forms that no one would question. A curve, a proportion, a placement that seems aesthetic on the surface, but carries a deeper meaning for those who recognize it. You walk through a cathedral and feel something you cannot explain. A sense of order, of alignment, of something deliberate beyond what your eyes can fully process. That feeling is not accidental. It is the result of decisions made with precision, guided by knowledge that was never written in full, only expressed through form. This is how messages survive without being spoken. A symbol carved into stone does not need a voice. It does not need permission. It remains where it was placed, unaffected by changes in power, untouched by those who do not understand it. It becomes a silent signal, visible to all, meaningful to few. And that is the key. These symbols were never meant to be hidden. They were meant to be overlooked, because something hidden invites discovery. Something visible invites dismissal. It becomes part of the background, accepted without question, ignored by those who are not searching for it. And that makes it the perfect method of communication for a system that cannot afford exposure. Now consider what that implies. If symbols were being used this way, then there had to be a shared understanding behind them. A language without words, consistent enough to be recognized across distance, subtle enough to remain undetected by those outside the system. This requires coordination. It requires agreement. It requires intention. This was not decoration. This was communication. Messages that did not explain themselves, but pointed towards something already known. Indicators that confirmed presence, alignment, belonging. A way to say, this place is part of it, without ever needing to state what it is. And once you start to see it, it becomes impossible to ignore. Because these markings are not isolated. They connect. They form patterns that extend beyond a single location, beyond a single purpose. They suggest movement, continuity, a system that exists across space without relying on direct contact. Now return to the idea of knowledge that was never written. If that knowledge needed to move, if it needed to persist, then it required a structure that could guide those who carried it. Symbols become that structure. They mark paths, identify safe spaces, signal meaning without revealing content. They are the bridge between silence and understanding, and that leads to something even more unsettling. Because if symbols were guiding those within the system, then someone had to place them. Someone had to decide where they belonged, when they would appear, and who would recognize them. That means there was coordination. That means there was influence. And that influence did not operate through visibility. So the question changes again. If messages were hidden in plain sight and knowledge moved without being written, then who was controlling the movement behind all of this? Because systems like this do not sustain themselves. They are maintained. And the ones who maintain them rarely stand where you expect to see power. Secret number 3. The power no one could see. At this point, the pattern is no longer subtle. Knowledge moved without being written. Messages existed without being spoken. Symbols connected places that should not have shared a common language. None of this happens without direction. None of this sustains itself without structure. And structure always points to one thing: control. But not the kind of control you were taught to recognize. Not crowns, not armies, not public authority. This was something quieter, something that did not need visibility to exist. Because the most effective form of power is not the one that announces itself. It is the one that operates without being questioned. Look at the world that history presents to you. Kings rise, wars are fought, borders shift, and authority appears to change hands. It feels dynamic, almost chaotic. But beneath that constant movement, something remains stable. Trade continues. Ideas circulate. Connections persist even when the visible world fractures. That stability is not accidental. It suggests the presence of a network that does not depend on the outcomes of battles or the decisions of rulers. A system that exists beyond political shifts, capable of adapting without collapsing. And the only way something like that can exist is if it operates in a space that is not directly affected by what happens on the surface. Now consider the role of those who moved between worlds. Merchants who traveled across regions carrying more than goods. Religious intermediaries who had access to multiple layers of society, from the highest authority to the most isolated communities. Individuals who were never at the center of power, but always close enough to influence it. These are not just supporting figures in history. They are conduits. They move information, align interests, maintain connections that others cannot see. They do not need recognition because their function depends on discretion. The less visible they are, the more effective they become. This is how influence expands without attracting attention. It does not impose itself. It integrates. It adapts to existing structures, using them as pathways rather than obstacles. A merchant route becomes a channel for more than trade. A religious institution becomes a point of access, a place where ideas can pass through layers of society without raising suspicion. And suddenly, the map of power begins to change. Because now it is not defined by territory or authority, but by movement, by connection, by the ability to reach multiple points without being traced back to a single source. This kind of power does not need to dominate openly. It only needs to guide quietly. That is far more difficult to detect and far more difficult to stop. Now return to the symbols and the knowledge that moved in silence. They were not random elements scattered across time. They were supported by something, maintained by individuals who understood how to preserve continuity without exposing themselves. This is where the hidden world becomes undeniable, because it is no longer about isolated secrets. It is about a system that connects knowledge, communication, and influence into a single structure. A structure that does not rely on visibility to function, only on consistency. And consistency leaves traces, not in official records, not in declarations of power, but in the way certain patterns repeat, regardless of what happens on the surface. In the way connections persist even when everything else changes. That is not coincidence. That is design. And once you recognize that design, another question begins to surface. If this system was so effective, so carefully maintained, then why do we know so little about the people behind it? Why do certain figures appear only as fragments, mentioned briefly or not at all, despite the roles they may have played? Because power that depends on invisibility cannot afford recognition, which means some of the most influential individuals of that time were never meant to be remembered. They were meant to disappear. Secret number 4, the people erased from history. Now the silence begins to feel deliberate. You have seen how knowledge moved without being written, how symbols carried meaning without explanation, how influence operated without visibility. But none of that exists on its own. Systems require people. And if the system was hidden, then the people sustaining it could not afford to stand in the light. This is where history becomes strangely quiet, because when you look closely, you start to notice absences, not just missing names, but missing roles. Entire functions that must have existed yet are barely acknowledged. Individuals who appear briefly in fragments, then vanish without explanation, as if their presence was never meant to be followed. And that absence is not accidental. Think about the kinds of people who could move between worlds without being questioned. Women who were never given formal titles, yet operated within households, communities, and networks where information flowed freely. They listened, observed, transmitted ideas without ever being recognized as authorities. Their influence was not recorded because it did not fit the structure of official power. But influence does not require recognition to be real. Now consider healers, those who worked with knowledge that was practical, immediate, and often misunderstood. They understood the body, the environment, the balance between elements in ways that formal institutions could not always control. Their knowledge could not be fully absorbed into official systems, so it remained on the edges, passed quietly, protected by those who knew its value. They appear in records only when something goes wrong, only when their presence becomes inconvenient. Otherwise, they remain invisible. And then there are the travelers. Individuals who crossed distances that should not have been easily connected. They carried more than goods or messages. They carried fragments of understanding, pieces of a larger structure that only made sense when viewed as a whole. Their journeys created links between places that history treats as separate, but that were, in reality, part of a wider network. These people did not need to leave detailed records, because their role was not to be remembered. It was to maintain continuity. This is what changes your perspective completely. History tends to focus on those who held visible power, those whose actions could be documented and justified. But systems like the one you are beginning to see do not rely on visibility. They rely on function, on individuals who fulfill specific roles without drawing attention to themselves, and that makes them easy to erase, not through destruction, but through omission. If a person is never fully recorded, they do not need to be removed. They simply fade from the narrative, leaving behind only traces that seem too insignificant to matter. But when those traces begin to align, when patterns start to form, the absence becomes impossible to ignore. Because something was there, something that operated with precision, with intention, without leaving behind the kind of evidence you were taught to trust. Now think about what that implies. If these individuals were essential to the system, if they carried knowledge, maintained connections, and ensured continuity, then their disappearance from history is not a failure of memory. It is part of the design, because a system that depends on invisibility cannot allow its key figures to become visible. The moment they are recognized, the structure becomes vulnerable. So they remain where they are most effective, at the edge of perception, present but unacknowledged. And once you understand that, another question becomes unavoidable. If so much was hidden, if so many were erased, then what caused this entire system to retreat even further into silence? What forced it to become even more difficult to detect? Because something changed, something that made the hidden world pull back, tighten its structure, and protect itself more carefully than before. And that change did not happen by accident. The turning point. Why these secrets disappeared. Something shifted. Up to this point, everything you have seen suggests a system that was stable, adaptive, and capable of surviving without exposure. Knowledge moved in silence. Symbols carried meaning. Influence operated without recognition. And the people who sustained it remained outside the reach of official history. But systems like this do not suddenly become harder to detect without a reason. Pressure creates silence, and there are moments in history where pressure intensifies to a level that forces everything hidden to retreat even deeper, not because it failed, but because it was forced to change. Now imagine a world where control over knowledge begins to tighten, where institutions start to define not just what is true, but what is allowed to exist, where variation becomes dangerous, and anything that cannot be categorized or controlled becomes a threat. In that kind of environment, visibility is no longer neutral. It becomes risk, because the moment something is seen, it can be judged. The moment it is judged, it can be suppressed. And the moment it is suppressed, it either disappears or adapts. This is the turning point. The hidden world does not vanish. It contracts. It becomes more selective, more careful, more precise in how it moves. What was once subtly present in structures and patterns becomes harder to recognize. What was once accessible through fragments becomes restricted even further. The system does not break. It reorganizes. Now consider the effect of standardization. When knowledge is gathered, defined, and structured under centralized authority, it creates the illusion that everything important is contained within that framework. It gives the impression that truth has been stabilized, that uncertainty has been removed. But in reality, it narrows the space where alternative forms of understanding can exist openly, and anything that cannot fit within that structure is pushed out, not always destroyed, but displaced. This is where the hidden system adapts again. It stops leaving even subtle traces in places that can be easily interpreted. It reduces its exposure. It relies more heavily on direct transmission, on controlled access, on methods that do not depend on physical markers that can be observed by anyone. It becomes quieter, and in doing so, it becomes harder to prove, because now, even the fragments begin to fade. This is why, when you look back, it feels as though something disappeared, as if the patterns you could almost see suddenly dissolve into the background, as if the connections weaken, not because they no longer exist, but because they are no longer allowed to be visible in the same way. But disappearance is not the same as absence. It is transformation. The system you have been tracing does not end. It adjusts to survive in a world where control over information becomes more aggressive, more structured, more enforced. It learns to exist with less exposure, fewer traces, and greater reliance on those who understand how to preserve it without revealing it. And that brings you to a realization that changes everything once again. If something can survive by becoming less visible, then its absence from the record is not evidence that it is gone. It is evidence that it succeeded. Now the question becomes even more unsettling. If these patterns withdrew, if they adapted to avoid detection, then where did they go? Because systems like this do not dissolve. They relocate. They evolve. And if they evolved, then traces of them should still exist. Not in the same form, not in the same places, but somewhere, waiting to be recognized again. The reveal, these patterns still exist. Now comes the moment that changes how you see everything. Because if a system can adapt, if it can survive pressure by becoming less visible, then it does not belong to a single era. It is not confined to the Middle Ages. It continues, quietly, subtly, shifting forms, changing methods, but preserving the same core principles that allowed it to exist in the first place. Look at the patterns again, but this time do not limit them to the past. You begin to notice something familiar. Structures that feel intentional beyond their obvious purpose. Symbols that appear decorative but carry a strange consistency. Networks that connect people, ideas, and influence in ways that are not immediately visible, yet undeniably present. It is not identical. It is evolved, because systems that survive across time do not remain static. They adjust to new environments, new forms of control, new ways of communication. What once relied on stone and space may now rely on different mediums, but the logic remains the same. Subtlety, selectivity, continuity, and once you recognize that logic, the distance between past and present begins to collapse. because the same questions still apply. Who controls the movement of information? Who decides what becomes visible and what remains hidden? Who operates within the system without appearing to be part of it? These are not questions limited to history. They are active. They shape the world you are living in, even if you do not immediately notice how. This is where the discomfort begins to grow, because it is one thing to observe hidden patterns in the past. It feels distant, contained, almost safe. But when you start to sense those same patterns in the present, the separation disappears. The idea that everything important is visible becomes harder to maintain, and that forces you to reconsider something fundamental. Maybe the systems that shaped history never truly disappeared. Maybe they adapted so well that they no longer need to hide in the same ways. Maybe they learned to exist within the structures you already trust, making them even harder to detect because they no longer feel separate. They feel normal. That is what makes them effective. Because the most powerful systems do not stand out. They blend in. They align with expectations, move within accepted frameworks, and operate in ways that do not trigger resistance. They do not need secrecy in the traditional sense. They rely on perception. And perception is easier to guide than truth. Now return once more to the beginning. The symbol. The pattern that did not belong, that should not have existed within the narrative you were given. It was not just a relic of the past. It was a signal, a reminder that there are layers to reality that do not reveal themselves unless you actively question what you see. And once you start questioning, something shifts. You no longer accept visibility as proof of importance. You begin to look for consistency, for repetition, for the quiet structures that persist regardless of what changes on the surface. You start to understand that absence from the record does not mean absence from reality. It means something else entirely. It means that what you are looking at was never meant to be obvious. And if that is true, then the final question is unavoidable. If these patterns are still here, still active in ways you are only beginning to recognize, then what exactly are you looking at when you look at the world today? You were never meant to notice this. Go back to the beginning. That symbol carved into stone did not demand attention. It did not explain itself. It simply existed, repeating quietly across places that should not have shared a connection. At first, it felt like an anomaly. Now you understand it was something else entirely. It was a doorway. Because everything you have uncovered leads to a single realization that is difficult to ignore. The world you were taught to see was never the complete picture. It was a surface, carefully shaped, stable enough to be accepted, simple enough to be repeated without resistance. But beneath that surface, another structure has always existed, moving with precision, adapting without being seen, leaving just enough trace to survive. You were not meant to notice it, not because it is hidden in some distant place, but because it is embedded in what feels familiar, in patterns that blend into the background, in systems that appear natural, unquestioned, inevitable. That is what makes them effective. They do not need to hide completely. They only need to remain unexamined. And for most of history, they have. Now consider what happens the moment you begin to see them. Not clearly, not completely, but enough to recognize that something is there. Enough to realize that repetition across time is not coincidence. Enough to understand that absence from the official record does not erase reality. It reveals intention, because what is remembered is not always what matters most, and what is forgotten is not always what was least important. Sometimes it is the opposite. Sometimes what disappears from the narrative is exactly what could not be easily controlled, categorized, or explained within the limits of the system that recorded it. That changes the weight of everything you have just seen, because this is no longer about the Middle Ages. It is about perception, about how reality is presented, how it is simplified, how it is shaped into something that feels complete, even when it is not. And once you recognize that, the boundary between past and present becomes irrelevant. The same mechanisms that once hid knowledge in symbols, in silence, in movement, have not vanished. They have refined themselves. They operate through expectation, through normalization, through the quiet assumption that what you see is all there is. But now you know better. Or at least, you know enough to question. And that is where the shift happens, because the moment you begin to question, the system loses its greatest advantage. Not control, not structure, but invisibility. It depends on being overlooked, on being accepted without inspection. Once that changes, even slightly, the patterns become harder to ignore. You start to see connections where there were none before. You start to notice repetition where you once saw randomness. You begin to understand that what appears simple may carry layers that were never meant to be explored. And that realization does not give you all the answers. It gives you something far more valuable. Awareness. Now, the symbol is no longer just a mark. It is a reminder, a fragment of a system that did not need recognition to survive, only continuity, a signal that what you were shown was never the full story, only the part that could be safely told. And once you understand that, the question changes one last time. It is no longer about what was hidden in the past. It is about what you are no longer willing to overlook in the present.